Okay, this is the second Chemistry and the Environment lecture, so lecture number 2. This material is from Chapter 3, Environmental Systems, Chemistry, Energy, and Ecosystems. This lecture will introduce you to the following topics. First of all, organic compounds, and we'll also discuss hydrocarbons. Secondly, macromolecules. There are 4 types of macromolecules: proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and lipids. And last, a short introduction to cells. Okay. Matter is composed of organic and inorganic compounds. And in the first lecture, we gave examples of inorganic compounds like carbon dioxide or molecular oxygen or water. Organic compounds are based on a carbon backbone. So they're carbon atoms joined by bonds that may include other elements such as nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Okay, so you can see below there are some examples. Hydrocarbons contain only carbon and hydrogen. Okay, hydrocarbons make up fossil fuels. The simplest hydrocarbon is methane, natural gas, which is CH4, a carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms. And hydrocarbons can be liquid, gas, or solid. Macromolecules are the building blocks of life, and they are polymers, which means they're long chains of repeated molecules. And the polymers, proteins, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates play key roles as building blocks of life. Lipids are not considered polymers, but are also fundamental to life. And we'll take a quick look at these 4 types of molecules again. These macromolecules are large molecules. They're lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins. Start with proteins. Proteins are made up of long chains of amino acids. They provide structure, transport substances, defend against invaders, carry messages, and promote certain chemical reactions. So proteins produce tissues, provide structural support, store energy, and transport substances. Again, they're made up of chains of amino acids connected together. Animal proteins generate or make skin, hair, muscles, and tendons. Some function as in the immune system. So again, this would be the role of defense against invaders. So in your immune system, there are proteins that will attack invading organisms that are trying to make you sick or just trying to get a foothold in your body. A very important function of proteins are the function of the proteins serve as enzymes. Okay, enzymes are molecules that promote chemical reactions, so that we sometimes hear the word catalyze chemical reactions. Essentially, they make them possible. So every reaction in your body that goes on is catalyzed by an enzyme, or a system of it, a series of enzymes. And those enzymes are proteins. Here's a quick look at a special process involving proteins. Nucleic acids direct the production of proteins. Okay, so nucleic acids are one of the categories of macromolecules, and there are 2 examples of nucleic acids found in nature inside of living things. They are DNA and RNA. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA is ribonucleic acid. And you may know that DNA and RNA carry the hereditary information of organisms. So the information that is passed on to the offspring. This information is created of long chains of nucleotides that contain sugar, phosphate, and a nitrogen base, as you can see in the image there. But that hereditary information, we talk about that as a gene, right? G-E-N-E. Genes are regions or segments of DNA of that long double-stranded molecule, macromolecule, that code for proteins. And those proteins all have specific functions, as we talked about. Proteins almost do everything. I mean, they have so many different roles. So genes are segments of DNA, and those segments of DNA code for specific proteins. They're the instructions for those proteins, the blueprint. A little discussion of carbohydrates and lipids. Carbohydrates are organic molecules or compounds consisting of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, atoms in the ratio of about 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So there's normally that ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 as a ratio of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. We can break them down into by size. Simple sugars, right, or simple carbohydrates are around 3 to 7 carbons long, so carbons linked together, carbon atoms. And the most famous example of a simple sugar, the one that we'll talk about quite a bit in the coming lectures, is glucose, right, which is the sugar that provides energy for all cells. And glucose is a simple sugar, a carbohydrate. Complex carbohydrates are structural, so they build structures, and also are involved in energy storage in organisms. So there are a number of these that you've heard of, like starch, right? We can think of starchy foods. Starch is a carbohydrate, right? A complex carbohydrate, which is used by plants to store energy, sometimes called a polysaccharide, right, for these bigger carbohydrates. We won't worry about that though. Animals eat plants and acquire that starch, right? Of course, that starch was intended by the plant as a savings for itself, right? Another important complex carbohydrate is cellulose, which is found in the cell walls of plants and in shells of insects, in the exoskeleton of an insect. Lipids are a very chemically diverse group of compounds. They're all grouped together based on their behavior and that they don't dissolve or break down in water. So water is said to be a universal solvent, but lipids do not. So they have that oily sort of structure that doesn't break down or dissolve in water. Lipids are used in energy storage, so fats are lipids. Cell membranes, our membranes in our bodies are made of lipids. Every cell membrane, in fact, of every organism has a phospholipid bilayer. We see the lipids also involved as hormones, so chemical signals used by organisms to send a message from one part of their body to another to have some organ produce some sort of response. Okay. Organisms use cells to compartmentalize the macromolecules, the proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. When we get to the level of a cell, at that point we're talking about living things. So essentially all living things are composed of cells. It's kind of a rule of life. If something is not cellular, at least, right, it's not alive. And it's a messy rule because viruses like the influenza virus are not cellular, and so technically we don't talk about them being alive. We can discuss that later on when we're talking about biodiversity. Cells vary greatly in size, shape, and function. There are tremendous diversity of different types of cells, and we'll look at some of those as we go on. Some organisms are made up of only one cell, so they're called single-celled organisms, such as a single-celled bacteria or an amoeba. Others are made up of millions of cells, such as plants and animals. We can group cells into two main categories, okay, that you need to know about. There are eukaryotic cells, or eukaryotes, and prokaryotic cells, or prokaryotes. Okay, let's look at the different types here. Eukaryotes contain a membrane-enclosed nucleus and various organelles that perform specific functions. Okay, these are the types of cells that plants, animals, fungi, and protists have. Prokaryotic cells are single-celled organisms that lack organelles and lack a nucleus. Examples are bacteria and archaea. Here's an image of the two cells. Note the eukaryotic cell has a large nucleus in the middle. The nucleus contains the DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid. The eukaryotic cell has organelles that perform specific functions, kind of like organs within the cell, right? And it has a membrane and it has cytoplasm. If you look up in the right corner, there's a prokaryotic cell. The prokaryotic cell has DNA, right, as do all living things, but it doesn't have it inside of a nucleus. So it doesn't have a membrane-bound nucleus where the DNA is. There is no organelles. That's another trait that prokaryotic cells do not have. But there is a membrane around the outside of the cell, right, that keeps things in the cell and also allows things to move back and forth. When we look at those words, kary, that refers to a kernel, like a popcorn kernel, and prokaryote means before the kernel. So the kernel means the nucleus. Okay, so it's the before the nucleus, whereas eukaryotic cell means true. Eu means true, and so that's an example of a true nucleus, right? And these are the two main types of cells in biology. I want to end here with a quick hierarchy of matter in organisms. All matter, all things that occupy space and have some mass are composed of atoms. We talked about the atoms, that there are different elements based on their subatomic particles, their protons, neutrons, and electrons, and they have different specific traits based on their configuration. Atoms can be combined together, right, to form molecules and compounds, such as carbon dioxide or oxygen gas or water. There are larger molecules called macromolecules. There are 4 types: lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. Each of them have different roles within living things. When something's alive, it consists of a cell, right? At least one cell. There are single-celled organisms and multi-celled organisms, And cells are compartments for macromolecules, right? They compartmentalize, they have a membrane around the outside. There are two types of cells, eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. Some organisms, some multi-celled organisms, have tissues, which are groups of cells that come together to form a specific type of structure. Tissues are things like epithelial tissue, which is like your skin, or muscle tissue, like your skeletal muscles. Tissues come together to form organs, like a lung or your heart, etc. And organs are categorized into organ systems, cardiovascular system, immune system, skeletal system, nervous system, etc. And organ systems are all part of an organism, right? In this case, we're talking about animals for the most part, like mammals, and those animals that have organ systems, organs, tissues, cells, macromolecules, molecules, and atoms. Again, that's kind of the line there between living and non-living in our technical sense within biology. All right, thanks. The next lecture that we'll be talking about will be about energy, and we'll be talking about a little bit about thermodynamics and the process of photosynthesis and respiration.